Hello and welcome again to Dark History Tales, where we put you face to face with royals of the past and discuss their history. What was really the face of Anne Boleyn? There's some fresh, intriguing evidence that has surfaced over the last few years regarding a missing portrait, which can potentially show Anne's real painted-from-life face to us. Today, let's discuss this fresh new evidence and look at some new facial reconstructions from this missing portrait. Anne Boleyn is infamous as King Henry VIII of England's second wife and queen, ultimately being falsely executed on his command in 1536. The sole uncontested picture we have during her reign is referred to as the most happy medal, which even with restoration efforts is a truly bad picture. The reason it's so difficult to get a glimpse of the real face of Anne is that after she died, her image was basically wiped off the face of England. Anything that had Anne's symbol was destroyed. So objects like this wooden falcon, a symbol of Anne, are incredibly rare. The political climate in Tudor England after she died was so amazingly tense. Whatever remained of this infamous queen, clothes, pictures, artifacts to endure, would have had to be hidden by her relatives or companions, and then also stored safely enough to endure over the centuries. One such portrait, which unfortunately exists no more for us today, was known to still be around as recently as 1773. This is referred to as the Lumley Portrait. Writers Elizabeth Levis and Richard Masefield have followed its trail, providing us with new information. The Lumley Portrait was a whole-length modern-day likeness of Queen Anne Boleyn that adorned her childhood residence, Hever Castle. It may have been commissioned by her father, Thomas Boleyn, which is part of the reason it might have been able to endure. Her family would have defended it at all costs. King Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, ultimately rented Hever Castle in 1540, only 4 years after Anne's passing, and she retained this portrait up until her own death in 1557. We never know whether Anne of Cleves liked her predecessor, but what this indicates to us is that she had enough respect and admiration for her to keep this portrait intact, and I think that's rather endearing, because in the end, the two women were victims of Henry VIII. When Anne of Cleves died, she left it to her friend Henry Fitzalan, who left it to his son-in-law, Baron Lumley, which is why we refer to it as the Lumley Portrait today. And then at some point during Charles II's reign in the mid to late 1600s, a fire sadly did some damage to the portrait, and we know that it had to be reduced to a shoulders-up format. And now that it had been more than 150 years since the tragic circumstances of Anne's life, they would no longer be recent or sensitive. They would simply be history. But now there was no longer a need to conceal Anne Boleyn's face. It is here that we notice a boom in duplicates of Anne's face being produced. It was not unusual for the nobles in their palatial homes to create extended galleries, essentially halls with portraits of earlier monarchs and queens adorning them. Of course, they would not be able to access the original portraits, so they would have artists replicate existing portraits. The Lumley Portrait certainly depicted Anne wearing the traditional pearl-lined French hood, black gown, and iconic B pendant. We know this from the sheer number of copies done in this same exact outfit, all framed the same shoulders up. Some copies naturally are better than others. We know the painting was sold to a private collector in 1773, and that is where it disappears from the records until suddenly, in 1926, the Howard Young Gallery took a photograph of a portrait of Anne that no longer appears to exist today. The sepia original is lovely. Many believed a lost original portrait of Anne would have been painted by Hans Holbein, the ubiquitous court painter. But examination of this picture shows that it actually has far more in common with the style of Jules Van Cleve, who also painted Henry VIII from life in a number of pictures. Van Cleve would have been in England on this commissioned portrait of Henry in 1532, and it's certainly possible he could have done the Lumley Portrait at the same time. What is really quite fascinating about the Lumley that historian Adam Pennington draws attention to is the arrangement of pearls underneath Anne's bee necklace. Do you see how they're splayed out and spaced? There's just one copy in the world with this particular pearl arrangement, and it's called the Lyndhurst Portrait. The pearl detail is an extremely fascinating one, and to me perhaps suggests the Lyndhurst was one of the first copies of this earlier Lumley, but to certain scholars it suggests something quite different. It appears the Lumley and the Lyndhurst portraits are both on panel. The two coincidentally are precisely the same size, precisely the same inscriptions, and precisely the same silhouettes. Is it possible that the Lyndhurst version is one and the same with the version photographed by the Howard Young Gallery in 1926? Maybe unrecorded restoration work discovered that the Lyndhurst is actually the original, lying in wait under a layer of overpainting. Honestly, I'm a bit skeptical of this theory just because the photographed version to me appears like it was painted by a far more talented artist, and the Lyndhurst appears like a sloppy imitation. But there's no way to deny that they do share massive similarities. Another interesting fact about the 1926 photo and the Lyndhurst is that Anne's hair is actually dark red instead of the usual brown or black she is normally shown with. This can also be seen in another painting entitled the John Hoskins Miniature that was painted sometime in the mid-1600s, and on the reverse has the inscription that it is a direct reproduction of, quote, an ancient original, so it seems that some of the most immediate copies of this missing portrait depict much more reddish hair than other subsequent copies. I mean, this does make sense. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was known for having red hair, and it was quite normal in Tudor England to be blonde or redhead. The physical descriptions of Anne during her lifetime all comment on her lovely dark eyes but never her hair color. It's even possible that Anne Boleyn was a redhead or had much more auburn hair than later portraits would imply. Let's look at the woman's sketches by Hans Holbein, said to be of Anne too. Don't they look more like the Lumley Portrait than other well-known copies like this one from the National Portrait Gallery? They both have the same prominent sloping nose, more full mouth and soft, slightly indented chin, unlike the other copies done later. One Venetian ambassador even wrote that Anne had a wide, full mouth, which largely contradicts all of the copies with these small pinched lips. But I guess all it takes is one painter to make small lips, and then suddenly all of the copies thereafter sort of play telephone with that detail. To me, the Lumley Portrait sketches are also the only representations that fit the most upbeat metal, the only uncontested image of Anne during her reign. Naturally, it's horribly damaged and slightly flattened, but it does depict Anne with a more full nose and mouth than are featured in any other portraits. In the portrait of Lumley, I notice great similarity between this claimed portrait of her brother George Boleyn and this miniature, which some experts opine might be a picture of her sister Mary Boleyn. They all appear to be siblings, and that to me adds validation to all three pictures. So I've done a few recreations from the Lumley portrait, and one from the Holbein sketches to compare. Let's have a look at those now. Where are we? Heat, 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 heat. I was also totally surprised when I completed the Lumley recreations that it resembles almost precisely an image that I did a few years back from a, quote, concealed portrait that numerous presume to be Anne Boleyn. Here's the portrait that researchers uncovered beneath a portrait of her daughter Elizabeth I. Now just a disclaimer that this concealed portrait is likely not Anne Boleyn, but the likeness is rather uncanny, which was fascinating to me. For that breakdown we created an entire video, so go ahead and watch that. Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you all in the next video.